We are now in part 2 of our lecture on Brazil, race, and the modern nation. You've just finished a video on the avant-garde. And the question for the avant-garde was always how to frame, how to question, how to probe, how to rethink what was right in front of you. And the central question for the Brazilian modernists, the Brazilian tangent or contingent of the avant-garde movement, boiled down to this question: how would they define Brazil? It was a Portuguese colony from 1500 until 1815. Brazil, by 1920, seemed to have forgotten any roots prior to that Portuguese colonization, as we can see from those centennial exhibitions, who could only look to Europe and Portugal to figure out how they should project themselves. The country was, and in many ways still is, a vibrant mix of European, indigenous, and African cultures coming together to form Brazilian identities. And Brazilian modernists wanted this multicultural identity reflected in their art. They didn't need the Impressionists. They didn't need this neo-colonial style of architecture. They wanted something that was truly Brazilian. And together they developed a new visual language that broke with Brazil's colonial and Eurocentric past, and that more accurately reflected the nation's vibrant heritage. Take a minute with this image. Okay, what are we looking at? What have we got? Let's start at the top. This sort of lemon yellow sun, right? It looks like possibly a flower coming off of the cactus with those radiating lines. Then to the left, we have a body, right? A figure. A very unusual figure, one with a teeny tiny head, long arms, a long torso, proportionately large legs compared to that tiny head, and then an enormous foot compared to the head. All painted in this very almost bubble-like manner. It's abstracted. It's not meant to be realistic. You have the idea of a human, of a sun, of a cactus, of the ground beneath, the sky behind. It's instantly recognizable. What is this thing? So the note on the right calls out the Portuguese word abapuru, which, excuse me, it's not a Portuguese word. It's a Tupi-Guarani word that's really important. That means the man who eats, what we would call the cannibal. So brace yourselves for what's coming. A painter named Tarsila do Amaral, who we'll look at in more detail throughout the lecture, gave this painting to this famous member of the avant-garde who was about to become even more famous. This real kind of pot stirrer, very progressive, very vocal, absolutely against that ridiculous centennial setup. Andrade argued that if they were going to celebrate Brazilian art, Brazilian culture, it shouldn't have been what stood there. He was vocal about the fact that something else needed to be done. And he in fact set up a very different exhibition called the Semana da Arte, or the Week of Art, where instead art that reflected that diverse body of Brazilian peoples was shown. So what we have here is Tarsila's painted image of one who is meant to be an indigenous figure, one of the early peoples, part of the First Nations of Brazil. And there's this sort of ridiculousness to the image, right? But that title, the fact that it's titled The Man Who Eats, or The Man Eating, the cannibal, in the language of the Tupi-Guarani, who are people who had always been thought to be cannibals themselves. Whether this was a fiction made up by the Spanish the Spanish and the Portuguese to make the region seem, heathen and horrifying and just in desperate need of Portuguese colonization and Catholic conversion, or whether they did actually carry on the practice of cannibalism. A stick in the sand, a line in the sand, a flag in the dirt is being posted and flown to say we're not looking back to Portugal when we create art. We are looking back to the Tupi-Guarani, some of the earliest peoples. We're looking back to their practice of cannibalism, and that is where we will find the source of Brazilian art, a truly Brazilian art, an uncolonized, decolonial art. So the visual contrast is striking. We have this European semi-impressionist painting on the right, and then we have something completely new, very modern in the flattening of the image. The attempt to create the illusion of depth, which we see on the right. You have the idea that the table is in front of the people, which is in front of the window. All of that's collapsed in Tarsila's painting, where there's a little overlapping, but for the most part, things are right on the same flat plane, as if they are shoved right up to the front of the image. In 1928, 5 years after that week of modern art, this anthropophagic manifesto, or cannibalist manifesto, was inspired directly by Tarsila's painting, the Abaporu that we just saw. The manifesto was written by Oswald de Andrade, and it was given the publication date of the anthropophagic era, the cannibalistic era, in the year 374, when Bishop Sardinha, Portuguese bishop, was purportedly eaten by the indigenous peoples, the Tupi-Guarani of northeast Brazil. This is a defiant act, right? A magazine is created called, as you can see at the top, Revista de Antropophagia, the magazine of cannibalism, the Cannibalist magazine, and here we have the Cannibalist Manifesto. And what exactly does it say? For polemical reasons, Andrade took this metaphor, the idea of the eating of the other, and raised it to new artistic heights. Cannibalism for Andrade implied the absorption of the enemy in order to appropriate its best qualities. Let that sink in for a minute. The absorption, the consumption, the digestion of the enemy in order to appropriate his best qualities. This was the metaphor for Brazilians' ability to appropriate European culture and transform it into something original. Not just the replication of it as we saw in the Centennial, but the transformation of it into something entirely new. This idea, the Cannibalist Manifesto, was inspired by a 16th century European text purporting to document the cannibalistic practices of the Tupinamba people. It came from the idea of a ritual interchange with the enemy, in this case, right, the European, the Portuguese, but also warriors on the battlefield who, in a cannibalist universe, take pride and self-satisfaction in having eaten or absorbed the very best of those they battled against. And it was a means of securing power over the enemy for oneself. Rather than looking at the Portuguese, the Europeans, and saying, oh, we want to aspire to be like you, This was a way of saying, no, we're going to take the best that you have. We're going to bring it back. We're going to mix it with our varieties of Brazilian heritage, and we're going to create something stronger, better, more potent, more powerful. There's a lot going on here, but this anthropophagy movement, or the cannibalist movement, can be seen as a link between the national and the cosmopolitan, right? A way of keeping Brazilianness, but still integrating ideas, ways of thinking, ways of painting, ways of navigating culture that were happening on the world stage. And it took, as I said, the symbol of this mythically cannibalistic first peoples of Brazil. The idea was that rather than assuaging their hunger, the act of devouring people had the ritualistic value of taking on the attributes of the other. It was part of a tribal ceremony whose purpose is to surpass the limitations of the individual ego by assimilating and assuming the qualities of one's enemy through consumption. Again, I would just want to emphasize the metaphorical terms that this is being written on. Andrade is in no way saying we're going to become active cannibals eating other humans. But the metaphor is there. Just be sure to hold that distinction. So this proposal that Andrade put forward, it's going to preoccupy Brazilian culture for decades. From 1922, 1928, when it was published, to 2002, when this quote I've just read to you is being spoken. So much of Brazilian art would be framed in these terms. It would be the appropriation, the digestion, the re-assimilation of things out in the world, reconfigured and shown through Brazilian eyes, shown through Brazilian culture. We don't even have time to go through all the incredible art that was done throughout the 20th century with this narrative framing in mind. So let's come back to this image. This idea of the anthropophagic movement, the cannibalist movement, was on the one hand an attempt to solve the tensions and contradictions of striving to shake off the patriarchal and colonizing roots of the Europeans. And on the other hand, it was an adaptation of the revolutionary, artistic, and cultural manifestos of historic European avant-garde movements. You saw in that film clip about just what the avant-garde is. This is a thing that the avant-garde does. They post manifestos, they set up their ideas, they make loud, bold claims and statements. Let's take another look here. This image is from 1641. I want to be clear that this far, far predates the work of Tarsila, whose Abaporu was published in 1922, or Andrade, whose manifesto was published in 1928. This is in 1641, right? What's happening in this image? In a way, it's this mix of the sort of the picturesque, the bucolic, and the horrifying, right? Here is a woman out in nature, going about her business, gathering food, gathering sustenance, gathering limbs, right? There's an arm, a hand, and a wrist in her right hand. There's a foot in the basket that she wears on her head. Look at the body. Look at that face. When this was painted in 1641 by a European, it was part of this invention and obsession with the idea of cannibals. As I said, it's possible that the whole idea of cannibals was itself a convention used by the colonizers to say, look, these people are horrifying. We have to convert them to Christianity. We have to go and take over their nation. They just cannot handle themselves. This is a trope that comes up again and again and again when someone wants to take over someone else's well-occupied land. So this cannibalism was a really important element in the representation of the discovery of the New World. From the 16th and 17th century, you just see it everywhere. Engravings and documents by different European travelers and artists during the time. Like this painting of a Tairino Indian woman. There's a desire to paint her as if she herself were part of nature, right? She's unclothed. What else gives you that idea? So what we want to think about is the way that even though Brazil's first people were already present in colonial literature and painting, which is what we're looking at here, that image was used to say that, oh, these people are part of nature. They are actually undomesticated. They are like plants and animals. They don't have the ability to govern themselves. And this reading carried over through 19th century Romanticism, where Europeans were writing about Brazil, writing about Latin America as if this were the case. And it created this sort of messianic and utopian function, right? That again aided the idea of colonization. What are we looking at here? Take a minute, write down and send me what you see. Pause the video. So we're looking at a drawing by Vicente de Rio Monteiro. It's called Anthropophago, right? The man eating. And it's made by a practically unknown painter from Pernambuco, which is a state in the northeast coast of Brazil. It was drawn in 1921. It's a very horizontal image, right? We get that first. And it shows a very sculptural figure, one whose musculature and body are almost like sculpted stone or sculpted marble itself. We see this figure lying relaxed on their back, right? Kind of with their feet up against a wall or some sort of structural tree or something else. Just relax, kick back, head fully back, and enjoying themselves. And as you zero in, you can see that what they're enjoying is a human femur. The image is one of like a paradise lost, right? This sort of like pleasure and enjoyment. Okay, for us it's a bit grotesque, but this pleasure and enjoyment that they're looking back on after colonization. This and the image prior are both really precursors to Tarsila's Abapuru painting. They are ways of trying to make that same connection of thinking about the earliest first peoples of Brazil and this modern rethinking, reconfiguration of what Brazil is itself. Here we see this conflagration, right, of high tech for the 1920s, this shiny plane with its propeller, that gleaming wing, the tires that are going to pull up, just all of the technology here, right? And then we see one of the indigenous peoples of Brazil examining that structure, admiring, working to understand. It's part of the absorption of the other, right? This new modern tech that's coming out of the United States and its reintegration into Brazilian culture in a new way. So let's put this in context. It's not only Brazil that's formulating an avant-garde. We saw the avant-garde in Mexico, in fact, through the muralists, through the work of Frida Kahlo, and many others that we didn't mention or have time to look at. But let's compare what's happening. In Europe, there was an avant-garde, those that you saw in that film clip. That kind of European modernism was about self-affirmation. It was about this very humanistic quest. The Brazilian avant-garde, on the other hand, was focused on politics. They were trying to overcome tradition with a very progressive, diverse vision, which they saw as the accurate vision of Brazil. So if the European avant-garde started with the elimination of the past as their way of thinking the new, they substituted individual artistic expression for the logic of the machine and sought to replace representation with some sort of spectacle, right? The Brazilian avant-garde, the Brazilian cannibalist movement, addressed the historical roots of the destroyed civilizations of the Americas in an attempt to recreate a non-aggressive relationship between nature and civilization, one that could again consume, digest, and absorb the other. We can think about all of this work in a couple of different terms. We can think about it through the sociologist Levi Strauss's work on the raw and the cooked, that nature is the raw, the unfinished, the untapped. The cooked is the socially and culturally processed. We can think about it through Freud's theories that were circulating at the time, where Brazil took on the taboo of their culture, the idea that in its earliest days they were cannibals. And they made that forbidden subject, that forbidden mode of life, right? The aspiration, the rule. It can be seen as a mode of moving from nature into culture, but we want to really push back on that because culture was always there. This is now one culture eating and absorbing the other. All right, you've heard me say this enough. You got the point, right? Let's look at this second image by Tarsila. Here we have the mirror image of that very first figure, the very first Abapuru with the tiny head and the huge feet. And we've got a new figure coming in. Still a very small head. This one with a very voluminous breast up in the foreground. And then again, a very large foot. Let's think about what this means. Before we do that, we're going to take a pause to think about manifestos, other manifestos happening at the same time as this one. Or at least as the one that inspired this work, called anthropophagia, called cannibalism, right? All right, manifesto. At the same time, or just around the same time as Andrade's Cannibalist Manifesto, we have the publication of the Futurist Manifesto. You can sort of imagine what futurism is going to look like. It's one of the European avant-garde movements, and it just adored modern technology, movement, machinery, the transformation of the body into these very machine-like parts. The work of futurists took on this techno-scientific world that humanity had entered into in the 20th century. On the other hand, different from the Futurist Manifesto in Europe. We have, again, Andrade's Manifesto Pau Brasil, which happens in 1924. This is the same year that Andre Breton published the Surrealist Manifesto. Again, we're going to get into Surrealism shortly, but this is a time of manifestos. Everybody's writing manifestos. Everybody's declaring what they think, and then creating art, shaping art around those ideas. So here we have the Pau Brasil. Pau Brasil simply means Brazil wood. Brazil wood was the very first export from the nation we now know of as Brazil back to Portugal, back to Europe. It was so predominant that the country took on the name of that export, right? Brazil wood. From that came the name of the nation, Brazil. The name for the wood came first. And what Andrade pinpoints at the bottom of that is that we have been, since colonization, we have been a series of raw materials used for export. That's all we've been. People come here, they take inspiration from us, they see this sort of tropical nature, they invent all these ideas and paintings and travel writing and poetry and literature, etc. But they're just taking from us. We're just exporting the very best that we are. And in the Cannibalist Manifesto, he turns those tables and says, we're reclaiming it. You're not exporting us, we are actually importing and reconfiguring you. Okay. So, as we can see here, in that manifesto is Tarsila do Amaril's work. This is her Abapuru. This is her man who eats. This is her cannibal, right? We saw the painting at the top of the lecture. So who is Tarsila? We're going to pause here and finish that in the last and final lecture.